The Importance of Intersectionality from Sam Farooqui. Sam is an undergraduate student pursuing a BA in psychology at Florida State University in Tallahassee, Florida, where she was a founding officer of the SSA at SSA. She was born in Pakistan and at age 7 immigrated to Florida, where she's resided since, but would like to move to a few different places in her lifetime. Sam likes initiating conversations about politics, identity or otherwise, feminism, intersectional or otherwise, and secularism, political or otherwise. But more than that, she likes going out and actually doing stuff relevant to these conversations. She's currently trying to decide about grad school, so if you have anything to say about that, talk to Sam, and I'm going to let Sam talk to you about intersectionality.
Hello? It's not working.
So that's not going to project to the mic, that's just for the
I see, okay. Intersectionality is an important concept in academia that has significant implications and prompts for practical group and community building. One of the questions that's really important regarding intersectionality and how it can be applied to real life instead of just something people are aware of in theory is, especially like relevant to the secular community, is as leaders and members of what we consider a movement, it is of the utmost importance that we consider who is this movement and this community for. So intersectional was a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. It's often used in critical theories to describe the ways in which oppressive institutions, racism, sexism, LGBT antagonism, xenophobia, ableism, classism, etc. are interconnected and cannot be examined separately from one another. So some examples using my own identities. Ex-Muslims often don't, ex-Muslim? I don't think it was in my description. We often don't feel welcome in either secular or Muslim communities, specifically because we're forced to do a cost-benefit analysis because there's no accommodation for it a lot of times. And also there's racialized Muslim identity struggles, whereas, as some of you might know, a lot of people assume that you can't be racist towards Muslims because Islam and Muslim are religious terms and not racial or ethnicity, which is often not the case at all. So in creating these communities and moving this movement forward to people who aren't often very well represented in this community and movement, one concept is also humanism. So if you're trying to create a humanistic or a group or community and movement, intersectionality it has to be necessarily present. Humanism is not a term for when you feel uncomfortable with feminism. Let's just get that straight. Humanism specifically for the secular context, being good without relying on supernatural escapism. So there are some issues with how the demographic that the secular movement and community has historically represented and been a thing for. So not being intersectional assumes white, straight, cis, etc. as a default. It posits those identities as a standard for normativity. For example, I went to Pride Toronto about a week ago, and as some of you might know, Black Lives Matter Toronto protested there, and a lot of people considered that protest to be an intrusion of people of color into what is supposed to be for something that's supposed to be for LGBT people, LGBT plus people. What they fail to recognize is that a lot of LGBT plus people are people of color as well. If you saw Secretary Hutchinson's speech yesterday, she touched on that. She said it in stronger terms, and those terms are still very accurate because it's seen as an intrusion that that compromises the purity of the secular community and the cause itself. Not being intersectional hinders non-normative populations from being part of the community. The most basic of these effects is erasure. Black atheists exist, atheist women exist, deconverts from religions other than Christianity exist. Can any of us here conceive of a black church that says that Black Lives Matter is invalid or irrelevant or not something that they should pay attention to. No. So this also is something that Fernando Alcantar not touched on, his entire talk was about this. Because religions don't, and religious communities don't stick to the religious aspect of it, but intimately involve themselves in the lives of their members, even people who don't actually believe in that religion are more likely to stay in that community because they don't know that there might be another community out there for them. I'm going to show a video, or part of a video that recently came out that caused kind of an uproar to really demonstrate like the kind of problem it is in the secular community sometimes. There we go.
Back in August of 2015, BuzzFeed made a video called 24 Questions Black People Get These. But I don't think it's hard to see why some white people get nervous around black people.
What are you going to do about systematic racism?
I have spoken out against the racist aspect of our criminal justice system, and I personally would not discriminate against black people. Beyond that, I have no intention of doing anything about it. First of all, I think the problem has been exaggerated. Second of all, it's not my problem in the first place. What are you going to do to end discrimination against atheists? Right, you ain't going to do shit because it's not your problem and you don't give a shit. What?
Hold on. So one of the things you can notice immediately about that part of the video, I don't want to, make you guys watch the whole video because it's absolutely terrible, and also would take a lot of time. But one of the things you can immediately see about that video is that it totally ignores the fact that black atheists exist. And as Sikivu Hutchinson mentioned in her speech, there are more pressing concerns than whether some, deity exists or not. Martin L. Hughes actually wrote several articles on Patheos, responding to that video and all the myriad things that were wrong with it. And this is a quote from one of those articles that I thought summed up the entire situation pretty well. Yeah, that's what I'm seeing. Atheism is a white America thing, and white atheists are increasingly proudly not caring about black people. Like, why am I going to fight for atheist rights when they are made up of so many bigots, over and above the black church that's fighting for my rights day in, day out? Why would I care about a predominantly white atheist club who cordons off race issues when that impacts my day-to-day life far, far more than what I do or don't believe about some non-existent God? I don't believe in God. But frankly, when I hear sentiments like this, I want to turn in my atheist card and go back to church. This wasn't shown on the video because the video was embedded, but when you look at the stats for the video, hundreds of thousands of people watched the video, and the vast majority of them liked it. Another thing that this does is it creates groups of guests rather than a community of members. This is actually a problem even outside of people of color, women, etc. Because a lot of secular groups, especially in universities and those arenas, end up becoming kind of like a spectator thing, where people come to 1 or 2 meetings and then it's not a thing for them anymore. A lot of the time it's because they don't actually feel like it's for them. I myself hesitated in being a part of the secular community for a long time, specifically because of this. Even today, there aren't that many I was a founding officer of SA at FSU, but there was a free-thinking group that existed on that college campus beforehand, and I knew of its existence, but I never really joined it, specifically because there weren't any ex-Muslims in there. It was a discussion group for how specifically Christianity has hurt those specific people, which does have its place, but creating a larger, more inclusive community and group is also very important. And it wasn't until I was able to have input into the creation of the new group that other ex-Muslims who were present on that campus came to group meetings and provide a more accurate window into the racial demographics of FSU, or religious demographics. Cool. Another thing is that you have to go out of your way to make your groups accessible to people. A lot of secular groups complain all the time, like, women don't come to our meetings, people of color don't come to our meetings. It seems like they know that they're there, but to me, those sound a lot like empty sentences because you don't see any substantive effort to get those people to come. So examples of how you can promote intersectionality, because like I said before, intersectionality doesn't mean anything if it stays in theory in your mind, you're aware of it, but you don't do anything about it. So being mindful of people who have never belonged to a normative religion. Obviously, this is really context dependent. So Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism specifically are very context dependent. So it depends first and foremost probably on your location. In the American South, the normative religion is probably going to be Christianity, and a very specific sect of Christianity depending on what specific locale. So one really easy, very specific tip is don't say religion when you just mean, for example, Christianity. That was one of the things that immediately turned me off when I was trying to get into this community, because people would talk about religions, but the things they said were very specific to Christianity, and on top of that, they treated Islam as a wholesale, monolithic thing. Whereas, I was born in Pakistan, sectarianism formed a big part of my young life, and that's not something that's ever mentioned in the West, anyway. So also being mindful of race and racialization. Which includes understanding how different religions are often conflated with the races and communities that practice them. For example, Southern Baptists are generally seen as black people, and Muslims are generally seen as brown people. That's obviously not true. Black Muslims exist, white Muslims exist. A lot of Arab Muslims would be they're often coded as white. So because of this conflation, religions are sometimes racialized, which is why the whole argument that Islam is a religion and you can't be racist towards Islam or the people who practice it just by virtue of Islam being a religion is a little bit specious. This is also problematic because it's often done to the exclusion of other demographics. So, for example, black Jews exist. Indian Muslims exist. That's more of nationality and how it's conflated with religion a lot. That one is especially a problem sometimes because Muslims are really persecuted in India. Middle Eastern Christians exist, and this exclusion is more significant than people think, because a lot of times the reason these demographics are excluded from those religions is because they're marginalized in those communities to begin with. So being mindful of divisions within religion. So going back to the sectarianism thing that I talked about, if you saw Hiba Krish's talk, I always love listening to her because she goes into the dynamics of socio-political and socio-economic factors instead of just saying, Islam existed before Muslims ever did. So another barrier to a lot of people is class. I know a lot of our groups are often confined to college campuses. What we did with SSA at FSU was we opened up our meetings and we advertised our meetings to people outside just the college campus. So we got people from FAMU, we got people from TCC, we got people who weren't going to college at that point at all. This also helps because if you open up your meetings, you can also coordinate with other groups that are secular in your area that aren't confined to college campuses. Opening up your meetings to those community members also addresses the class aspect of intersectionality, because a lot of people aren't college educated and they don't have the same access to the type of non-religious community that you might be used to. So historically, the atheist, secular, agnostic communities have been white, relatively affluent, and formally or college educated. As we all probably know, there are atheists and agnostics outside of those demographics, but when we when we cordon off issues that affect their daily lives more intimately than just the existence of a God, we hinder them from joining these spaces. Another thing you can do is taking opportunities to support marginalized communities seriously. For example, like creating space for women to contribute to discussions instead of positioning all discussion as a free-for-all in which those who are most assertive get the most space. So for example, this is something that happened like just this past weekend. Someone was trying to explain gender dynamics and all of that, and another person was basically saying the same thing but talking over the first person. Well, basically like just taking it upon yourself to be like, well, this person has got it and you don't need to like talk over them right now, you can take a turn or something. On that note, you should also like promote like conferences that are for marginalized populations within your microcosm in your college campus and your community in general, because that allows people to see that even though you might not be doing as good as you might not be doing as much as you could simply because of like factors like circumstance and the kind of members you already have. These conferences allow people to see that this is actually a priority in the community and there are people who are doing this. I'm going to finish up really quickly. Okay. It isn't enough to simply be, so like one conference is coming up is Women in Secularism in September. I'm going to plug that shamelessly. It isn't enough to simply be aware that identities function intersectionally if no effort or action is effective to use that knowledge. Overall, it's not just like the awareness, but the adoption of intersectionality that will ultimately make your groups more diverse, larger, and more capable of accommodating people as people and not just separate and disparate identities. The end.